Hello there, I'm Pierce Lopagian with the Abilene Interfaith Council. We usually meet once a month during the school year, but because of the pandemic, we can't. But in lieu of those meetings, we are interviewing prominent religious figures here in Abilene, Texas, and also taking tours of houses of worship. This evening, I'm joined here today by Reverend Andrew Penns of the Valley View Missionary Baptist Church. Reverend Penns, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Well, gratefully, I'm honored to be here with your group, the Interfaith Council. I did look forward to being able to give a tour to the group. As I stated, the Curtis House Cultural Center is a center that houses the early years history, Black history of Abilene, Texas. And I have been a part of a nonprofit, Interested Citizens Abilene North. This is one of our projects that we have put together. We opened this facility in 2016 and started with very little pictures and other historical artifacts. Have now pretty much outgrown itself with the history that's been gathered. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to sit and speak with you today, and hopefully that we will be able to learn some Black history, early years Abilene history from today.
That is wonderful. Again, thank you so much. My intention is to just get an interview from you, and then in a moment we will take a tour of this historic Curtis House. But let me ask you this question. So the year was around 1954, when the United States Supreme Court said that segregation was unconstitutional. However, if I'm remembering your story correctly, you were in school during that time. Tell our viewers, which many of them, some of our members are millennials, we have no idea what segregation was like. What was that like here in Abilene, Texas?
Well, to be truthful with you, to experience segregation as a young man, I never did really identify the difference. I do know from early years in growing up, my experience from listening to my parents, my mother, my father, the racial tension and experiencing segregation was very prevalent. I do recall an incident. I might have been about 6, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Went to a fountain, soda fountain, which was called back then, and might have been Walgreens or whatever other pharmacy it was, and sat at the counter, the lunch counter, and the gentleman that was taking care of the soda fountain said we could not sit there. And I wanted to know from my mother why, and she explained to me, well, son, we are just not allowed to sit at the counters. But that was not good enough for me. I always did want to know. And after growing up, I actually got involved heavily in civil rights. When Abilene, particularly Abilene, I talk about Abilene a lot, when Brown versus Board of Education declared that segregation shall not be anymore, the Abilene School Board and many of the leaders primarily did not accept the change coming into integration, and they were reluctant from school board, from other administrators. They were reluctant to actually integrate. And of course it was not only Abilene but other cities as well. But Abilene, the reason I say Abilene, because I grew up here and I experienced that, segregation taking a lot longer, or integration taking a lot longer than what it had hoped to had changed, but it did not take place right off. To experience that, like I said, we were comfortable in our neighborhoods, even though we could not go to some of the other elite or more elaborate restaurants and other places. But one thing that I was proud of is that most of segregation, there were lots of blacks that had their own businesses. And even as we talk about the neighborhood here, there was a business district on North 6th between Plum and Mesquite Street that housed most of the black-owned businesses, even though there were several other areas. But we had our own stores, we had our own restaurants, we had our own washaterias, cab companies, service stations, you name it, barber shops, beauty shops. So there was not much of a need to have to go somewhere else. But it was still a hard pill to swallow, knowing that if you, and after I became an age of about 17, 18 years old, and not being able to go in the front door, but had to go in the back door of a restaurant, even somewhat on the bus. We were not allowed to sit pretty much at the front of the bus, but you had to sit at the back of the bus. So that was a pretty traumatic thing to have to experience. And then as I began to learn more of segregation, it was, it was pretty tough.
It was an injustice.
It was an injustice.
So, going from there though, in 1967, you were sent to the Vietnam War,
Yes.
if I recall correctly, and you had experienced all of this injustice here in the United States, and yet you were sent to war. Many historians believe that that war was somewhat unjustified. But nonetheless, did that ever test your faith in God when you were sent to war? After you experienced such injustice at home, you went to war on behalf of your country and served our country. How did that feel for you?
It was pretty tough still.
Yeah.
Like I said, as a young man, I was actually 18 years old, leaving Abilene, Texas to go off and fight a war. And I'll tell you a story that actually taken place when I actually went ahead and volunteered. My draft notice were up and I went ahead and volunteered. But when I left going to El Paso, Texas, from Abilene, Texas here, they had each of the recruits to actually stay in the Windsor Hotel.
Really?
And that's why most military, when we left, we stayed there that night and loaded the bus next day. I was the only black in a group of about maybe 25, 30 whites, and there might have been one or two Hispanics. And in staying at the Windsor, the whites all stayed together.
Yeah.
And they gave me a room separate from
Really?
the whites at Windsor Hotel.
And so if I heard you correctly too, your draft number was up, so you did not necessarily have to go, but you volunteered nonetheless.
Well, it was either, during that time, it was either go ahead and get drafted
right?
or volunteer. So, and of course with Abilene, wanting to get away from Abilene, which I was ready to go. And that was a way out.
Yeah.
I felt it was a way out. I was not actually getting ready to go to college. I had turned down a scholarship. Had actually
You're a
turned
wanted man.
turned down a scholarship to go to art school.
Oh wow.
Because my parents, there were 8 children in my home, and I being the second oldest of 8 children, I knew my mom and dad could not afford to send me to college. So I didn't go right off to college, but also military would allow me to also get an education.
Right.
So I actually went ahead and went in the service. But leaving from here, loading a bus to go to El Paso, Texas to start my training, that was pretty, it was pretty blunt to say, well, here I am, have signed up, have taken an oath, but yet I cannot stay in the same rooms with the whites.
Did that make you mad at God, or just mad at the country?
No, I wasn't mad at God. One thing, I never did get mad at God. And that's one thing. I surrendered to preach really at the age of 12. I'm 13.
Really?
I committed my life to Christ,
Mhm.
even though I steered off. But I always did believe in God. My parents always instilled in us to have a Christian life and to never question God about some things, even though I question Him now sometime about things.
Sure.
But that's part of life. But I went ahead and went into service and began my training. But that was another eye opener. When we actually got to El Paso, started our basic training, I ended up experiencing integration.
Right.
That was my first experience of integration, living in the same barracks with white, Hispanic, other nationality, Puerto Ricans, you know. But I told a story to a group on Saturday. One of my experiences is that in the building that we were in, they would put us in bays of 4, bunk beds, 2 to each bed. In my bay, there was a white, there was an Indian, myself, and one Spanish, all mixed. And in military, you know, guys had a way of sometime picking on the weaker ones. The white gentleman that stayed in our bay with us, it was an open bay. Several of the white guys came in and what they call short sheet, tighten the sheets up, and then they would sort of give them a rough time.
No.
Myself, the Indian, and Hispanic got up out of our bunks because they woke us up. And we went to the aid of our white friend. And from that day forward, wherever we went, he went, because he knew we would take care of him.
You had his back.
We had his back. And he actually was from Tennessee. And during that time he was there, his mother had written him a letter. And she specifically said to him, his name was Teller. No, it wasn't Teller, different than the Indian was Teller. I do not want you to mix with the niggers that are there.
Really?
Yes. But I became his closest friend. And he couldn't understand why his mother would say something like that. But he had never experienced integration himself.
Sure.
But from that, we became good friends. We finished basic training, went to advanced training. He went one way, I went another way. I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana.
I have so many more questions about that, but just for time's sake, I want to move on. We're going to just go right into the future. If I'm recalling your story correctly, you ended up in Austin for a while and worked at Texas Instruments, but then you were called back to Abilene, is that correct?
Well, I actually came to Abilene. I was there that was Texas Instruments opened doors for me.
Mm-hmm.
I went to work for them as a security officer.
Okay.
And after I got out of the military, and was adamant at Abilene. I was very angry at Abilene because could not get a good job, trying to get education started and trying to build a life. So I went to Austin. I had a cousin who worked for Texas Instruments. Went down, applied, and they hired me right off. And I went in security. I had a brother my 4th brother passed away here in Abilene. And my brothers and I had just began starting a business. I had not planned to be in the business. I was just going to support the business and financially support it. But that brother passed away. So I'd taken a leave of absence, came back to Abilene, and had only planned to stay here just for a short span until I got a few things straight, got the business leveled out. I was going to return to Austin, but not in intention of staying in Abilene.
Yeah.
But God worked a miracle. I actually got a notice that Texas Instruments was opening up in Abilene. I called my boss in Austin, shared with her what I had heard, and she said, well, I'm not aware of it. I actually called Lubbock, because they had opened up a facility in Lubbock. I said, yes. I said, well, I'm here in Abilene. At that time, I think I had 8 years experience with tenure with the company, had left security and went into computer operations. So they said, well, we need a computer operator in Abilene. And since you are experienced, you know how to set it up and everything with the technicians. So I accepted the job, went to Lubbock to train for a few months, and I came back and set the data processing facility up here in Abilene, Texas. First black that was hired. Of course, I was already in Texas Instrument, but I was first black that started working here. And I served 17 years before they kicked me out the door.
Really? And then what was the inspiration to highlight some of the racial problems and divisions here in Abilene that ultimately led to this historic home being open?
Well, I actually relocated to Abilene and finally settling down and began to raise my family, got married here and began to raise my family. Within 3 years, 4 years, I went into the ministry anyhow. And still saw a negative feel of Abilene. Even though integration had taken place, things were beginning to change, but when I would go to City Hall or the county, when I'd see at the fire department, on the police department, there were still very few blacks that were in position and were getting enough jobs. So actually I began to get involved with the NAACP in Abilene, Texas. Eventually became the president, served there 12 years until I just resigned and said, that's it, I'm tired, I'm just giving it up. But there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Robert Lewis who took me on his wings. I began to work in NAACP. His demise, prior to his demise, he asked me, would I consider becoming the president? So I accepted. I didn't want to be in the leadership, but I accepted. But then that showed and opened doors to lots of greater prejudice that was still existing in the 80s, early 80s, that was still existing. So I began to work in NAACP. I became a lifetime member. Worked lots with Claudia Rawls, who was also a pioneer civil rights worker here. Robert English also, which served with me as our first vice president. We experienced and saw lots of housing discrimination, and how we proved that is that we would send a white person to look at a home, and they would show the home, and then a week later we'd call for the same home and send a black family, and they would be discriminated against on that in an exclusive neighborhood in the white community. Also, there was some issues with some levels of police brutality at that time too. We actually teamed up with LULAC, went to Washington D.C. with a delegation of NAACP leaders and also LULAC leaders, and we canvassed Washington D.C. about the police brutality and some of the things that had taken place from the black community as well as from the Hispanic community. So lots of that was still, segregation was still in, and even more so, we were able to get us an office and to have our identity as a national NAACP branch in Abilene, Texas. There was still lots of stigma that was put on against us, and lots of prejudice that we went against. I ended up having to have an unlisted phone number. Cell phone wasn't prevalent at the time, but I ended up with an unlisted phone number, and then also to have all my mail forwarded at the P.O. box rather than get it at my home.
So you were sent things that were terrible, I have to assume, and people called you.
Yes, yes. And several incidents we worked as far as segregation, discrimination, job discrimination. We were blessed to win several cases from that. And I worked, and actually I became a lifetime member and still am a member of the NAACP. And then eventually our branch began to dissolve and it lost its status. So it made some changes, and I got out of civil rights. I came out because my wife was ill during that time. I needed to focus. Later years, I had a daughter that got ill, so I had to refocus on their health and welfare. So I got out of civil rights for a good spell. But I still noticed lots of things that were happening in the schools. Even in the 80s with MLK Day, the county, the city would not close. The city was actually having they would do the MLK banquet every year.
Yes.
But they would never close City Hall. The county would never close the county. The school would never close the schools, even though it was designated
A national holiday.
A holiday, yes.
Right.
So that was even taking place in the mid-'80s. So you still see that, even though integration was in,
Right.
Abilene still had a level of segregation. And even today, and we talked about it back then, but let's talk about today. When we look at the MLK Boulevard, and a lot of people don't know, that is not actually a designated boulevard. It's on the honorary.
Right.
And Abilene is one of the few cities that, it's one of the few cities that does not, major cities in Texas, that does not have a designated MLK Boulevard. So I do a protest every year. I didn't even get in the parade this year. I was gonna ride, but I got busy here. But every year that they march across that bridge, that's my protest. And until I see a designated MLK Boulevard in Abilene, I can say then that Abilene is pretty much where it needs to be. Sure, we now have a black mayor. We now have
Yes.
a black police chief.
Who is your cousin, the mayor?
Yes,
His
yes.
cousin,
And,
okay.
the police chief's not related to me, but
He just arrived.
he just arrived.
Yeah.
But that's a stepping stone of several things that have happened. But we were able to, in the mid-'80s, early '90s, start working with the city government. We began working with county government, even to a level of state government, that MLK Day would be recognized, the school would begin to close, the city would close, the county would close. So that was a stepping stone there.
And so MLK Boulevard, in your mind, would that be that stretch of road from the bridge on East Highway 80 all the way out of town?
It should go. It should go all the way. It
Right,
should go
yeah.
all the way. And it should be designated. It shouldn't be honorary.
Right.
I just believe, and of course, the mayor at that time, Dr. Gary McCaleb, and we're best of friends, but
He's
he
great.
knows my attitude about the bridge, and Dr. Leo Scott, who was one of the prior councilmen that served. To me, I felt that it was more an appeasing to the black community. We'll give you a bridge and be quiet.
And that's it.
That's it.
That's all.
We'll give you a bridge,
Yeah.
put a stone wall at each end of it. It taking the act of Congress to even get the sign put up that says MLK.
Around what year was that?
Maybe early '90s.
Early 90s, yeah.
Yes, somewhere in the '90s, or maybe late '80s, early '90s when that taking place.
Yeah.
Might have been late '80s.
That's amazing. Well, we're going to take a quick break so we can move these chairs, and then I want you to take us on a tour of the first level of Curtis House.
Curtis
We'll be
House.
right back.
Great. We're standing in the Curtis home. The Curtis home is a prominent home that actually belonged to the Curtis family. The Curtis family were prominent funeral directors and served Abilene, the black community, for well over 50 years. This home, built 1932, was built by the dad, Sam Sr., Curtis. His name was Sam Curtis. The wife was named Sammy Curtis. And also, they had both, their birthdays were on the same date also. But the Curtis home here, before they actually built the funeral home, this actual room served as the holding place for deceased whenever there was a death in the black community. Could not go to Elliott, could not go to North, and could not go to one of the other white funeral homes here in the city. So they actually put together a funeral home with another funeral home out of San Angelo, Texas, which was Stark's Funeral Home. So they called the home here Curtis and Stark's Funeral Home. So that's how it came about. They eventually built a funeral home, or took an old home and converted it into a funeral home, which is located, the building is located down on Cockrell Drive in North 7th. The building sits on North 7th and the corner of Cockrell Drive.
So it is still there, one can go.
Well, there's not much left there now.
Not much left of it.
It's just the building itself
Okay.
is actually condemned.
Okay.
And the last person that owned it, I don't know what happened, but it's actually sitting condemned. And I don't know, if we could buy it, we probably would try to buy it and get it refurbished to actually look like it did during that time. They actually opened this 1953. 1954.
Would it be eligible for a historical marker?
Possibly. It's over 50 years old.
Yeah.
And once, well, you have to actually say 100 years old. Once it's
okay.
100 years, you can designate. We might be able to get by, but most times for a marker, the place has to be 100 years old. So
Okay.
it did not survive 100 years. But we are hopefully, at some point, we'll probably have, excuse me, I'm gonna get some water in a little bit.
Yes, sir.
Probably have this location
Mm-hmm.
as a historical site,
Yeah.
because it's part of the original plan from the Curtis family. So when we think about this home and the history that's in here, the Curtis family, they all made up part of early years Abilene history and served the community. Even though there were 3 other funeral homes, black-owned funeral homes in Abilene, Texas, they lasted longer than the other 3.
And all the rest of it.
Yes.
That's amazing.
So we're standing in the history of this room here. I actually went to school with one of the granddaughters.
Okay.
And I knew most of the grandchildren that actually lived here as well. But one of the granddaughters, she was a classmate. And the story was shared with her and from her and her daughter is to recollect when they came back to visit the Curtis home that we had put the history in. One of the granddaughters said they never could remember coming into this room here. And then most people that actually came to the home, you never came in the front door, you came in to the side
To
door.
the side, okay.
Because this room was set aside specially, and they always kept it closed off to utilize it for the community. So it's a very prominent place. It has a lot of history, lots of memories. In here we have Sammy and Robert Stafford's picture. They were educators here in Abilene, Texas, way back 1931, 1932. Both taught at the all-colored school for a few years, and later years, Mrs. Sammy Stafford actually would commute to Colorado City, Texas, and she taught there for all-black school. The school board had just named the school after them, so that is actually Sammy and Robert Stafford. A longtime educator. He actually served as principal at the all-black school, Abilene Colored School. And then later years, after he stepped down from principal, then he actually taught math at the Woodson High School, College of Woodson High School. So we have that picture, and that picture was donated by their son, Robert Stafford, to at least have their history here. And I have some other pictures of them also as well.
And what were, Reverend Pins, just before I forget to ask you for our audience, what were the names of the other schools? You mentioned Woodson High School, but what were the other names?
For the black schools,
Yes, sir.
well, from about 1819 or so, there were really no schools other than it was called all colored school.
Just all colored schools.
All colored school. Now, later years when they finally built a school for blacks, which was a small school. It was still called Abilene Colored School,
Mm-hmm.
but when they organized the football team, they called the football team Abilene Black Eagles.
I read that and it
Yeah.
shocked me, but we are in 2021,
Yes.
so.
And then they
It's
would
not-
give the hand-me-downs, the books, the uniforms, band equipment, all that would be handed down from Abilene High School.
Was their thought process just because you were second-rate citizens?
Yes, we considered second grade. Now, in 1955, 1953, actually the year before Brown versus Board of Education,
Mm-hmm.
they finally built the Carter G. Woodson High School.
Okay.
Now, remember, they changed the name from, well, they didn't change the name, it was still Abilene Colored School, but when they went to Woodson, it was still called Abilene Colored, but in 1955, they declared that it would no longer be called, from the principal and the staff, the educators, they declared that it would no longer be called Abilene Colored School, and they named it Carter G. Woodson Elementary, and then Carter G. Woodson Junior and Senior High School. The elementary school finally was built on State Street between Ash and, on 9th Street between Ash and Plum Street. And then they built the new school, the Carter G. Woodson Junior Senior High School in 1954. And that brought some problems, because when Brown versus Board of Education, 1955, there was some black parents that was content with letting their kids stay at the Woodson Junior Senior High School. It was a brand new school,
Right.
and they were just reluctant. But then there was another group that was beginning to fight NAACP, and several of the black community leaders, some of the pastors, were pushing after Brown versus Board of Education to bring integration in, which was still reluctant. Now, well, we're talking about integration, how it came about. About 1956, 1957 or so, there was a black captain, Captain John Rice, that had come to Dice Air Force Base. There were 5 mothers, African American mothers, black mothers, that had come from northern cities that were also military. They would see their children they would bring their children out to back gate of Dice. The Dice elementary kids, white, Spanish, Japanese, whatever, at Dice, they would go and walk into the school. The elementary kids had to get on the bus, the high schoolers had to get on the bus and be bused from there, way across town, to go to the elementary school and the high school. The mothers petitioned, along with Captain Rice, the base commander, that their children had already experienced integration. Here they was having to go back to segregation. Dice Air Force Base, the base commander petitioned the school board to go ahead and declare integration to come in. The school board said no. I actually saw some of the minutes that was written about some of the negative things that were said, that we don't want those ends to be with our sons and daughters.
Yeah.
Then also there was a gentleman, Dr. Steve Galloway, who wrote his thesis concerning segregation in Abilene into integration. I have his thesis in here.
Was he for it, against it?
The school board was reluctant. They said no.
Right.
And actually, I think the board, Brown versus Board of Education ended up back in court. They went back to court.
Yeah.
And federal government said integration should be. Abilene was still adamant about integration. So the base commander sent it to Washington, to the federal government, and shared with them about what was taking place in Abilene. The federal government said, either you will integrate or we'll pull federal fundings. You know what happened? Integration started. Dice was the first school that started the integration process in Abilene, Texas.
Do you think if we hadn't had Dias Air Force Base, segregation would have kept going on until
it actually would take place? You know, so I don't know. Like I say, I was still a young person, so lots of that I didn't know. My parents, they were pretty much a part of the transitioning part and knowing more of it than I did. I learned that history later years about that, and I thank God for Steve Galloway, who's a good friend of mine, sharing that thesis with me to where I learned. But I had already saw the records in the administration of them reluctant. And we did place a historical marker at Dice Elementary that in January 21, just this day, 1963.
Maybe the camera wants to, one of the cameras want to get to that.
You need to bring it out. That's significant. This day, 1963, is when they began to go ahead and start the process.
So we really do have the military to thank for integration, and that brings me to the next place I want you to tell us about, and to go, yes sir, if it's all right with you.
That's
your
fine.
military room. We have more light in there too.
Yeah,
Tell us more about this area. This room is.
When you step in here, this is a very important area as well, because in this room, you don't see not one white in here.
Right. Yeah.
And it's because of these gentlemen here that's on these panels. Yeah, these are World War II veterans that served Abilene. And their picture, their names and picture, is in a book titled Taylor County World War II Veterans. I worked at the county juvenile for several years. And we had a tour that went out to Elmdale, Airstrip, and that was a book. We found, the students and myself found that book, and as we were thumbing through the pages, and I saw it, and I got interested, I said, because I have an uncle that served World War II. And they asked, Mr. Andrew, where are the black soldiers? I said, well, keep turning. And sure enough, at the back of the book, that's where they were at.
So again, they weren't allowed to be in alphabetical order with their white counterparts.
The whites and Spanish and others were at the front, alphabetically, by their names and everything. Each one of these soldiers were at the back of the book. And they had gone off to fight war. Several of them came from Camp Barkley. These are Camp Barkley soldiers here. At the bottom, and one of the pictures, or one or two pictures over there. This is actually down on North First, South First.
This picture here?
That's on the railroad track.
That's on the railroad track, and this is?
This is downtown, either Cypress or Cedar.
Okay.
This was in front of the Drake Hotel.
Which is now the Grace Museum.
No.
No?
The Windsor, not the Windsor, the
Woodson.
Which was the Hilton Hotel.
Oh, okay.
That was, you see there, you see Hilton on there.
Wow.
But these soldiers were all black units
And from Berkeley.
from Camp Barkley.
Barkley, rather.
From Camp Barkley, marching downtown Abilene. These soldiers, most of them, several of them went to school here. Others married, their families here, went off, fought in World War II, but yet came back. Could not be in the front of the books with the other military soldiers. Could not get the jobs. Many of them, several of them, had post-traumatic stress.
Sure.
GI Bill was not offered to them. So lots of them ended up either on alcohol, struggling through life. Some made it pretty good for themselves.
I see one man has a mugshot here.
Actually, that's
Or is
not a
that-
mugshot.
Okay.
That's actually the Curtis. Where's it? Frank Curtis was the brother to Sam Curtis.
Really?
And it said it. I thought it was a mugshot.
It does
But
kind
it's
of look like
actually-
it. I
it looked like
apologize.
that.
Mhm.
But he has his uniform on, and I don't know, but it's military.
Yeah.
So
I
don't
can
know how
see
they
he does
take
have a
pictures.
tie there.
Yes.
Oh,
This is my dad's brother,
okay.
Henry Pence, who also was not born here but grew up here. Did not attend school here, but came here as a young man and went off into World War II as well. So these gentlemen, and what we did, I asked to borrow the book, and I got the book, I petitioned the board, let's get these pictures out of the back of the book, let's put them up front so they can get recognition. So lots of them, before they passed, were able, several of them was up in age, but several of them were able to see their picture
Yeah.
on the front and not in the back.
Where's your picture?
My picture's here,
I thought you were somewhere there, right there.
18 years old,
That's amazing.
just going in the military.
And what is the significance of this? Is this an organ we're seeing here?
This organ, it has significant story also.
Okay.
This organ, which is in the picture here, this gentleman, O.C. Lacey Jr. This organ has a story. It actually was housed at the Woodson Elementary School for a while.
Okay.
Later years went to Woodson High School. He taught music in the elementary school. These were some of the elementary students. This organ, when they closed the school, most of the equipments, the football, the band uniforms, trophies, all of that was scattered.
Yeah.
This actually ended up in the recreation center, just setting off in a corner, and the kids were beginning to destroy it.
Hmm.
I petitioned the parks director about the organ belonging to Woodson, and they did not have a record that it belonged to them, so we got it and it's refurbished. It plays well, and we brought it here because of the history. And the significance of this gentleman, O.C. Lacey Jr., was one of the first blacks to teach music at Dice Elementary.
Really?
Only two blacks.
Yeah.
Jerome, when they integrated, he taught music, and another gentleman by the name of Jerome Whitmill were the only two blacks that went to school to teach there.
I have so many more questions, but we're coming to an end of our video. We usually try to keep it as short as possible, but
Yes.
hopefully we will have another time to come back and visit. What's one more room that we should see before we end the interview? Or is this?
Let's go to the sports room.
All right,
This
onto the sports room we go.
Yes. This is history too, but
Okay.
we'll go to the sports room. This is history as well. Artifacts, different things, but I got a light out so it's not as light, as much light in here.
That's Barack Obama.
We talk about our sports room because it's important, because during the eras of football, they first started in 1934. We had the first football team that was organized, and they won state championship. We all played all black teams.
Yeah.
because integration was not in.
And there were Black Eagles.
The Black Eagles, these gentlemen here were Black Eagles, this group here,
Okay.
those three pictures. From this group to this group, these were the Woodson Rams. When they changed the name, they changed also the uniforms. These were black and gold. These are green and white. The basketball team, football team, and the stadium we played at is right there on Leggett, so where Fair Park, Rose Park.
Yeah.
Curly Hayes, the little field, that's the football team.
Okay.
And the black team could not play on Friday nights. We have a book written by Michael Hurd that's called Thursday
Night Lights.
Because most black teams throughout the United States pretty much, where integration was not prevalent, the black teams either had to play on Thursday nights or Saturday nights. And the white teams had preference for playing. So this room here houses our football team from the start to not the very last. The very last team I did not get a picture, but it actually decreased from 11-man team down to a 6-man team. Integration had come in, and lots of the students from 1968 actually began to go to Abilene High. Then after that year, they actually closed the school. So it was not as many. Even the last team I played on in 67, we were down in numbers, and most of us had to play offense and defense and everything.
I'm going to try to pretend I know where you are.
62, I believe, would be my
The number?
picture. Yes, right next to 52. I think that's me there.
Right here.
Yes.
Wow.
And then also I'm over here. My brother's just above me. My brother and I played together, my oldest brother. That's 66. He was actually a senior, and I was a junior in high school. And I'm actually in this book also, Thursday Night Lights.
And can, if our viewers are interested in purchasing that book, is it available where?
You can get it on at Amazon, but you can also go to Texas Star.
Okay, so Glenn
Yes.
and Carol have that.
Yes, they have.
Wonderful.
And if they don't have it, they can order it for you.
Okay.
I have gotten many copies through them from the time this gentleman, actually Glenn Drumdugal brought this gentleman here
Yeah.
to do a book signing. So we were blessed to, and he and I had known each other, but it gave us a chance to get better to know each other. And also, I have several autographed copies that was signed in memory of, in recognition of my history of playing football. So the sports room, we're beginning to add some other pictures. We're changing up a little bit because we have the elementary school. And I just found out they were called, instead of being called the Woodson Rams, they were called the Woodson Yeldons.
Okay.
And their uniforms were blue and white, and the high school was green and white.
So, Reverend Andrew Pence, we sincerely appreciate this opportunity, and we've just, I feel like we've just scratched the surface, so we want to try to come back. But I have one more hot topic question, the last question of the evening.
I hope I can answer that question.
I think you can. You've been great this entire time. So, what I've learned from your interview here and going through this historic Curtis House is that race relations were really bad in Abilene during the time in which you grew up, and even before that as well. Mm-hmm. Compare that to now in 2021. Has it changed all that much? Is it better, or do we still have a lot of work to do?
Well, I think we've come a long ways. Mm-hmm. One thing I can say since I came back to Abilene, I have been involved in a lot of the change. I made up my mind when I came back, first and foremost, that I was not going to allow anything to keep me from excelling. And I've been blessed to have a good life here. But more so, I've gotten involved with others to help see the change come about. And I think today Abilene has come a long ways. We still have some ways to go. But we also have found in the last few years the divide coming back. So we're having to now to readjust. And I pray that one day that we will be able to, even in our churches, I work with a group of pastors, One Kingdom. I meet with them every Monday, and we discuss even our churches. And over the years, and that's just been traditionally, that on Sunday mornings, our churches are the most segregated hour throughout the United States. And the problem with that, a lot of it is that it's not that the blacks won't go to the white, is that when the whites are invited to come to the black church, who shows up? The pastor and maybe one of the deacons and his wife. And that's been an ongoing thing. But we're working to hopefully build a better relationship, and especially here in Abilene, that Abilene will be a city that can set an example. And we're not going to ever get rid of segregated things. Sure. And prejudice. Right. It's going to be there. Hopefully, I'm hoping that maybe my great-great-grandchildren will see a difference. But for right now, it's not going to be, because there's still a lot of stigma, not only from the white community, but there's also prejudice in the black community. So and from the Hispanic. So you still have that low line that's going to be there. But my plea to anyone that comes to our tours, and especially if there's a black group or individuals, never let anything stop you from excelling. I went through a whole lot, but there was many who went through much worse than myself. But my attitude, even though I left adamant at Abilene, I decided coming back that if a change is going to be, then I'm going to be a part of that change. And I'm going to excel. I'm grateful that I was one of the founders of this nonprofit. I'm grateful I know the history from the black perspective. I've been involved with lots of boards, lots of committees, and I've seen things begin to get better.
If someone wants to take a tour, what do they do? How do they contact you?
They can call the office. I don't ever remember that office number.
That's okay. We will put we'll put a link of all that information.
And if not, they can call my cell. Okay. And I will be more than happy to set a tour. With what's taking place with the coronavirus right now, the COVID, is that we schedule tours, we schedule them out. We do not accept, try not to do more than 10 at a time. Okay. You must have a mask. We will sanitize tonight. When you all leave, I'll have to just sort of spray things down and sanitize before we leave. But we're following the city guidelines. And we'll be more than happy. I'll be more than happy to do a tour.
Well, Reverend Pence, this has been a wonderful evening to share with you, and thank you so much for your candor and this time to have an interview and a tour of Curtis House.
Good.
I want to thank everyone for watching this video. Again, my name is Pierce Lopachin, and we will have more videos to come of other places of worship and also interviewing religious figures as well. On behalf of everyone at the Interfaith Council and the board of directors there, we wish you well in this pandemic, and peace be with you. Thank you. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you again, Reverend Pence. You're wonderful, just wonderful.